The information shared in this episode is not intended to serve as a substitute for mental health services and is only intended to provide education and information to you, the listener. Thank you for tuning into the Honeybee Podcast. In today's episode, I have the good fortune of sharing space with Mia Reid. Mia Reid is a licensed clinical mental health counselor, a limited licensed professional counselor, and the founder of Change Happens Today, a private practice agency that is located in Southfield, Michigan. Mia has over 25 years of experience working in higher education, where she assists students with problem-solving conflicts and crafting helpful resolutions to the matters that impact their daily functioning. In her practice, Mia provides support to clients who experience various concerns related to stress, anxiety, depression, grief, attentional difficulties, mood disorders, and post-traumatic stress. In addition to providing support to teenagers and adults, Mia conducts group therapy, where she has found it extremely beneficial to the group members in reducing their sense of isolation and lack of belongingness by connecting with their peers. Through her experiences of participating in individual and group counseling after experiencing the loss of a child, it is Mia's purpose and her mission to share the tools and strategies. Without further ado, here's Mia. Hello, and thank you for joining the Honeybee Podcast. I have the good fortune of sharing space with Mia Reid, clinical mental health counselor, LLPC, owner and operator of Change Happens Today, based in Southfield, Michigan. In this conversation, Mia will share a wealth of information that I trust will be beneficial, inspirational, and illuminating for you, the listener. Hey, Mia, how are you doing today?
I am doing great. Thank you so much for having me on.
It is my pleasure. I really appreciate you taking the time to share the valuable information that you're going to share with our listeners today. First, to get started, before we get into the meat of our conversation, could you please share with the listeners the sort of work that you do, the population that you delight in serving, and anything else that you think would be valuable for us to know?
Okay. I am a clinical mental health therapist, and I service individuals that are suffering from depression, anxiety, grief, trauma, and any type of issues that are preventing them from moving forward in their life. My niche is grief and trauma.
Can you speak to the age group that you typically work with? Because from my experience, grief can happen to
Yeah.
children as young as 6 up to adults in the age range of 100 plus. Can you please speak to the age group that you typically provide services to?
I typically provide services to teens and adults. I don't normally see children. And if a child is referred to me, I usually would refer them out to a specialist that deals with children.
That makes absolute sense. And so then I'm curious to know, what is it about the topic of trauma as well as the topic of grief, or the experiences of the two, that creates this passion for you to be of support to your clients?
Well, several years ago, I lost a child. And not only did I lose a child, I lost a child to murder.
Mhm.
And so during my journey, I experienced complicated grief. And I couldn't understand why I wasn't getting better, even after I was seeing a therapist. Once I started doing the work with the therapist, I learned that I also suffered from PTSD, which is a form of trauma. And once I learned about PTSD and the symptoms, and I was able to gain the tools and strategies to cope, and it worked for me, I wanted to help others because suffering from trauma is very deep. And if you don't understand what you're suffering from, if you don't understand the symptoms, and if you don't get help, it will basically prevent you from moving forward in your life. And so I was just so happy and excited that I was able to move forward in my life. My purpose and passion is to help others so that they can feel the same way that I do, because I'm in a really good place.
That is a blessing. And so I'm happy to hear that you are in a good place. And it's such a beautiful gift for you to be willing to be of support to others who've experienced trauma in light of you having experienced your own. And of course, I'm sorry for your loss and so thankful that you were able to find a place of healing and feeling equipped and able to be of support to others. So I acknowledge you for that. And so, in speaking about trauma, if we don't know that we've been in a traumatic situation or that we have PTSD and we're stuck, right? We avoid thoughts associated with the traumatic situation. We avoid discussing our experience of the traumatic situation, which I would imagine could inhibit or block the grieving process. So, for you to have the focal point in therapy while providing treatment to clients who have experienced trauma, I'm sure that they're also experiencing some form of grief. Is that right?
Absolutely. And because grief and trauma are different, in order to get through the grief journey, you must address the trauma first. Because, again, as you mentioned, avoidance is huge, and that's a common reaction to trauma. And because those that experience trauma tend to avoid, it's hard for them to experience the emotions of their grief journey. And in essence, they are stuck.
Tell us more about working with clients who are navigating their experience of the grieving process. How does your work with them support them in that way?
Well, first of all, we would go through some tools. We would use some tools and checklists to make sure that they're actually experiencing complicated grief. Usually, when someone is coming to receive help, that means that they haven't been able to get through the grief process normally, because grief is a normal reaction to losing someone or something. And if you're having issues moving through the normal process, usually your grief has become complicated. If your grief has become complicated, usually we'll go through a series of checklists because I want to know where they are in their grief journey. Time is a huge factor that gives me an indication if someone is struggling. For example, when someone's going through the grief journey, it's normal to have experiences such as shock, pain, anger, depression, denial, guilt, bargaining. All of those things are normal. And if those things go beyond 6 months to a year, then normally there's an issue. There's something else that is complicating their journey. And that's what we would focus on.
And Mia, forgive me if you already described this. You used a unique term that many of us may not have heard of before, and I believe that term was complicated grief. Can you say more about that?
Normally, when you are going through grief, because grief is a normal reaction to losing something, you usually would experience just acute grief. And acute grief is normal, it's a normal reaction to a loss. And you're going to have some intense emotions, such as the ones I described, such as pain, denial, guilt, bargaining, even depression. Some people experience depression for a small amount of time. And after, I would say, maybe 3 to 6 months, if you are not starting to feel better and your symptoms are not starting to slowly, go away with the passage of time,
Mhm.
then most likely you're entering into complicated grief.
You had mentioned that you experienced traumatic loss and I would imagine complicated grief. Can you speak to our listeners about your journey and what you are up to be of support to others who have experienced trauma as well as complicated grief?
I experienced complicated grief because my grief was lasting more than 3 to 6 months. My grief was carrying over into years. And because of that, I had to seek out some help. Initially, I had a stigma for therapy because I had never been to therapy. And that's something many people experience because you have no knowledge of it. And if you don't understand what therapy is, you're intimidated.
Mhm.
And I finally developed courage and I decided to seek out help. And the therapist that I went to specialized in grief and trauma. And because that therapist specialized in grief and trauma, he knew what to say to me to make me feel comfortable. And what made me feel comfortable was he told me, "You are not alone. You are a grieving mother that has lost a child." And that was the first time that I had heard that. I had heard so many other things, such as, "It's going to be okay. Just suck it up. You have to be there for your children. You had him for 24 years. God wanted him more." But nobody made me feel like the things that I was feeling were normal, and no one validated my feelings. And so when I finally went to the therapist understood because that therapist had a skill set in that particular area. And he made me feel comfortable and he just knew exactly what to do. And we went through the normal processes. There's some normal processes when you have an intake with a client, and there are checklists and so forth and so on. And so he had an idea of what I was suffering from. I did not. And he never said, "You're probably suffering from this." We worked together. And the information that he gave me and the homework that he gave me, I pretty much learned that I was suffering from PTSD. And then we talked about it and we discussed it and we did the work so that I could cope with it.
And so prior to going to therapy, what were you doing to try to reduce the intensity of the grief and the pain that you experienced after losing your loved one?
I did the only thing that I knew how to do because I've been brought up in the church all my life and I'm religious and I totally believe in God and I love God and I have that spiritual feeling on the inside of me. I went to church more than I would normally go and I prayed a lot. And although I think that church and prayer are huge tools when you're dealing with an issue and you need to cope, some issues, such as mental issues, because I was having a mental issue, I was having a mental breakdown. And those particular issues have to be addressed by someone with a skill set in that particular issue. And that wasn't something that I was doing. And therefore, I was stuck.
I've had conversations with many people over the years that are pro therapy and people who are opposed to therapy. And I'm thinking of personal loss when I was a teenager and hearing the many things that you had said, Mia, like suck it up or it'll be okay or just pray, right? And prayer, absolutely. I believe in prayer 100% and God 100%, right? And that was not enough to help. And so, what I ended up finding is that many years later, when I was able to even face having that conversation about losing my loved one, that I have pent up a lot of emotion and pent up a lot of confusing thoughts and pent up a lot of pain that could not be resolved with prayer alone. So, I acknowledge you for being willing to like notice your discomfort with the whole therapy thing and of course going to church and praying and eventually finding, using your words, courage to go and meet with a therapist. I'm so thankful that he was helpful for you.
Yes, he was. And I'm so thankful that I found the courage to go. And not only was he a specialist in grief and trauma, he was also a spiritual therapist. And oftentimes people don't realize that, you can choose whichever type of therapist that you want. And I decided to choose a spiritual therapist. And because I chose him, we shared the same religion. And so we were able to incorporate that into my therapy healing.
And so then that leads me into, because I know what you're up to, but our listeners don't know what you're up to. Tell us about this program that you're developing.
Okay, so during my journey through grief and trauma, when I worked with the therapist, he did something that I didn't expect a therapist to do. So we talked about faith. And when we talked about it, he asked me how was my faith. And I told him my faith was on fleek because I say that. And he asked me, well, did I believe the prayers that I was praying? And I told him, yeah, I did believe the prayers that I was praying. And he asked me about, what was I doing after I prayed? And I said, I'm just waiting. But in essence, I really didn't believe the prayers that I was praying. I did a lot of praying, but after I prayed, I still did a lot of worrying. I did a lot of talking to other people. I still had the same symptoms. I didn't actually use my faith because I didn't know how to use my faith. And so one day he asked me, had I ever heard of the book of Job? And I said, yeah. And I knew about Job's story. And he asked me, had I ever read it? And I hadn't read it. And the therapist opened up the book of Job and we literally read Job together. And that was my homework for several weeks. He gave me different scriptures in Job to take home and to read and to just think about and to come back. And we discussed it. And something just clicked for me. I just got a better understanding of my faith. And eventually I was able to lean on my faith. And once I started leaning on my faith and believing that working with that particular therapist was going to be successful, it actually was. And the way that I was able to do that is by changing my mindset. Changed my mindset from being fixed on just church and prayer. Although I still incorporated church and prayer, I also opened my mind to therapy. And once I opened my mind to therapy and believed that it was going to be successful because I used my faith, I crossed over to a growth mindset and I was able to grow and move forward.
That is wonderful. Say more about the fixed mindset and the growth mindset.
Well, during my journey in healing, I came across a psychologist, and her name is Carol Dweck, and she's the one that coined the phrase mindset, fixed, and growth. And I studied it because I wanted to know more about it. And her fixed and growth mindset actually was geared towards school children because she wanted to know why some of the children did really well and some of the children didn't do well. And what she found is there were some children that had courage. They had enough courage that they didn't mind failing and they still wanted to know if they could succeed. And then there was another group of students that were afraid to fail, so they could not move forward. And so for me, I had a fixed mindset that I was afraid that I was going to disappoint the church or disappoint God by not just praying and going to church to be healed because that's what I've been taught all my life. But what I did was I opened my mind and I allowed myself to have therapy. And once I did that, I grew because I incorporated something else. And that growth for me helped me to cope.
That is wonderful. I love it. I think that that's going to be for sure a source of inspiration for people to learn more about the fixed mindset versus the growth mindset, because clearly, upon your learning about it, it created a wealth of transformation for you.
Yes, it did. It really did. And It helped me to develop my own program, which I have been using to help my clients. And it's called My Power Punch for Change. And what we do is we focus on a growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset. Because a lot of people do come to therapy and they want to be helped, but unless they are willing to face challenges, unless they are willing to fail, because some people may be in therapy for years. It may not work out exactly the way you want it to in the beginning. And unless you are there to accept the good with the bad, you won't be able to move forward. So I try and use that in the beginning, working with my clients. That way they have an open mind and they're there for the long haul and they want to grow.
Tell the listeners more about your program that you are developing or that you have developed, My Power Punch for Change. Is that something that people would need to come to Southfield, Michigan to check out? Is that something that's happening virtually? Tell us where you're at with this program and what people can look forward to for our listeners in Michigan.
I have developed this program and I have already been using it with my clients. And it's mostly for my clients that are spiritually based. And what it involves is three elements, the three elements that helped me when I began my journey for healing. And it involves prayer, therapy, and faith. And what I tell my clients is we punch our way through any issue because you have the three elements that nobody can penetrate. Prayer is not man made, faith is not man made. And you have me, your therapist, and we are going to develop a therapeutic alliance, a relationship of trust, of confidentiality. I am here for you. And so once we go over that, I explained to them that you can still pray. You can still have your prayer. Even though you're coming to therapy, I am not pulling you away from whoever is your higher spirituality or your
Mhm.
church or your pastor. I'm not taking you away from them. You can still pray. You can still go to church. We're just incorporating an additional element because I have a skill set in the area that you have an issue in. So you can have all three. You can still pray for the things that you want to happen. You have therapy where you're doing the work. What I tell my clients is faith without works is what?
Dead.
Yes. So you can still pray, you can still go to church, but you're going to come to therapy and you're going to do the work so that we can get you through this issue and give you some tools and some strategies to cope. And then you're going to have faith. I'm going to have faith that the prayer I prayed is going to be successful. That
Mhm.
way, you pray to the Lord to send you to the therapist that you feel is going to help you and help you to be successful. Then you have faith. You have faith that the Lord is going to deliver that for you.
How have your clients responded to this wonderful program?
They respond well. I have been working with at least 5 clients with this particular program, and they have been coming to me consistently.
Five on the way to 500. I'm so happy to hear that. I think it is, at least to me, and from my personal experience, it's so curious to me and such a beautiful thing as well that for many of us who have experienced a personal tragedy, we are somehow able to create something that is brilliant, that is thoughtful, that is inspirational, that is helpful in the healing process for others. And that's exactly what you did, Mia.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Now, I have to ask you, I typically ask my guests to share a kernel of truth or a nugget of wisdom for our listeners. What would you like to leave the listeners for as food for thought?
As food for thought, I will always tell people this is the truth. You are not alone. When someone is going through heartache, when someone is going through hardship, when someone is suffering from grief, trauma, the first feeling is I'm all by myself. No one could possibly be feeling the way that I feel. This is the truth. You are not alone. And as much as it feels like it, once you take that step forward to talk to somebody that has a skill set in the issue that you're having, you're going to learn that there may be someone else that have experienced what you're experiencing. Although everybody is different and we all have our own experiences, there's a lot of similarities, such as with grief. You hear that there are 5 stages to grief. Although I believe there's several stages, more than 5, there are 5 common stages. And most people do feel those stages. Most people are in shock when they lose someone or something. Most people do feel a sense of guilt. Most people do feel a sense of denial. I cannot believe this has happened.
Mm-hmm.
And most people do feel like they may want to bargain, like, just one more day with this person. I would do anything. How many of us haven't lost something and we've had that thought, if I could only have just one more day? And hopefully at some point, most people have an acceptance unless they're dealing with some type of complication to their grief. So those common things most people share. And so in the beginning, you don't feel like that. You feel like you're all alone. So I would say to someone that is suffering, seek out help. There is someone with a skill set that can help you in the issue that you are having. We are here.
Yeah, I so appreciate you. I will be sure to put your contact information in the show notes so people can learn more about you, your programming, and what you are up to in general. I hope you have a great rest of the day. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. I was so grateful to have Mia on today's episode. I think she truly gave some valuable information about her experience with grief counseling and how she used her experiences to help others through Change Happens Today and her program, My Power Punch for Change, which helps her clients utilize both faith and therapy to cope with loss or trauma. I have included Mia's contact information in the show notes, so be sure to visit her website, changehappenstoday.com, in order to learn more about Mia's amazing work and her super cool program. And since you'll be on the internet learning more about Miss Mia Reid, be sure to go to my website, myhoneybeetherapy.com, to see what I am up to and to catch up on my blog, as well as any previous podcast episodes you might have missed. Thank you again for tuning in to today's episode of the Honeybee Podcast. Until next time, peace.